Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. In this segment, I want to talk about your skin, the integumentary system, and the physiology that's related to it. Now, as you know, this is the most visible system that we have in our body. It can contain different amounts of pigment that gives skin coloration, but it's actually the way in which we interact with our surroundings the most. We have scents, various types of chemical communications that we can actually use via our skin and the glands that are in there. But more about that in a little bit. So if we look at a picture of our skin, we find that it's made up of several layers. The outermost layer is the epidermis. There's a layer which is much larger than that, which is the dermis underneath, and then there is subcutaneous tissue, fat and other connective tissue that underlies that. Many times this is also on top of muscle or even on top of bone. Now, on that epithelial layer, the epidermis has several layers. Those layers actually start at the base closest to the dermis and grow outwards, such that by the time that you get to the topmost layer, the skin cells are predominantly dead, and they provide sort of a coating on you that prevents you from drying out and also does a few other functions, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So that system of cells is constantly growing in the epidermis and growing out and then sloughing off. In fact, we actually slough off quite a bit of skin. It is visible if you look at things such as dandruff, but it's also made use of by several other things. For example, there are lots of microscopic creatures that munch on your skin that has sloughed off. We use in various types of detection capabilities through things like airports, tufts of air that will take some of the skin particles and look for things such as explosives or other components that we might be interested in people smuggling on board of a passenger plane. So those are all on the sloughed off skin. Now, between the epidermis and the dermis, this layer is actually not as a sheet. It's actually corrugated, if you will. That means that there are indentations that allow for better connection between the epidermis and the dermis. And this is critically important because if you applied a shear force to your skin and you didn't have this kind of connectivity, then you would just simply shear off or slough off that epidermal layer. We all know and have the personal experience where we'll have fluid that will collect between the epidermis and the dermis and actually have a blister that then rises up and separates those layers. Now, in the dermis, there are lots of different types of cells. There are various types of sensory cells that can detect things such as temperature or pressure. There are some smooth muscle cells, the erector pili, which actually then are connected to the shaft of hairs which are present on your body, and that allows for the hairs to then stand up and create a stagnant layer of air that is over the epidermis. And so, for example, if you become cold, one of the adaptations that you will have is that those erector pili muscles will cause your hair to stand up on end, sort of the goosebumps that people will describe, and that will create a stagnant air layer which will allow for warmth because you'll hold that heat a little bit better. At the base of those hair follicles, there are cells that are in the epidermis that grow outwards. And this is an important idea because when you have burns that take off or you have sloughing off of large layers of skin, as long as there are hair follicles, you can regrow that skin. The base of those epidermal cells in the hair follicles also have adjacent secretory glands, and those glands will create a fluid that will go over the skin, and also certain types of glands can release chemical messengers called pheromones that are volatilized when they get on the skin that can send chemical messages to other humans, for example. Now, there are also blood cells, blood vessels that are in the dermis, and those blood vessels will allow not only for nutrients to reach the dermis and the epidermis, but they'll also provide for heat transfer. They'll also take waste away, and those are very important components. If the temperature of the body is lowered, one of the adaptations that the body will make is that it will crimp off these small arteries and not have blood flowing to the surface of the skin. That can, with time, lead to things such as frostbite. There are also cells that are present throughout the dermis and also the connective tissue and the subcutaneous layer that are fat cells and fibroblasts. There are various immune cells such as macrophages and mast cells, because many times when you actually have a cut or some sort of disruption in the skin surface, you can have the bacteria which are present or the fungi that are present on the surface of your skin get into your body proper, and there needs to be a way to sort of combat that. Now, on the surface, on the epidermis, we also, as I alluded to, share with lots of different microscopic organisms. We have bacteria, predominantly for humans. Those are Staph aureus and streptococcal bacteria that are present. We also have fungal, and many people will recognize that sometimes if you take antibiotics, you might get a fungal infection afterwards in certain areas of your body that are moist. And this is sort of overgrowth. This would be things like athlete's foot, for example, in the moist area and the webbing between your toes. So what does your skin do? Skin is responsible for several things. First and foremost, it's protecting you. It's protecting you against desiccating or losing lots of water or having lots of fungi just take over your body by overgrowth. It is pretty much impermeable to most substances, so that when you go and swim, you don't actually dissolve. It does allow for transport of lipophilic substances, in particular the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, and steroid hormones. In fact, there are a number of medications that are lipophilic that are used in a transdermal or a patch that's placed on. Certainly some types of contraception are done. For men, testosterone is a hormone that can actually be placed on the surface of the skin and absorbed. Now, we also will regulate our body temperature, and that is predominantly through several mechanisms, but the main one is through evaporation. You remember from general chemistry that the heat of vaporization of water is very large. And what that means is that when you put water on the surface of your skin and there's enough energy, i.e. enough thermal energy that you can volatilize that, you actually have a cooling effect from that evaporation. I do make vitamin D in the skin. It's not the active form of vitamin D, which has to go to the kidneys in order to be made, but it is made in the skin with sunlight. And as I mentioned, it also the skin also serves a sensory function, both for pressure, temperature, and then also for pain, directly for certain types of substances, for example. So let's talk a little bit more about the thermal regulation, because this is one of the most obvious things that our skin does. In order to have the enzymatic reactions occur, in order to maintain homeostasis, we have internal thermal sensors. They're located in the hypothalamus in the brain. Some are in the spinal cord and in the abdominal viscera, and then also in the great veins, the thorax, that maintain a core body temperature between about 97 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Should that temperature change, it could either get hotter or colder. Now, if it's hotter, then I'm going to try to go through that evaporative process as we talked about before. I'm going to actually try to radiate heat by basically being a black body radiator, but also by evaporation of water. But if I'm cold, I can't light a fire under myself. So what I do is I initiate several mechanisms by which I can actually raise my core temperature. One of the first things that's done is that I can shiver. In shivering, I'm going to take skeletal muscles and I'm going to have them contract, release, contract, release, contract, release, but not actually do any type of movement or work. So it's not like I'm walking from one place to another when I'm shivering. It actually is using the energy that I have from the ATP for the contraction of the muscle to generate thermal energy. I'll also reduce the evaporative loss from sweating. I won't sweat when I'm very, very cold. And I will vasoconstrict the blood vessels in the dermis so that I don't lose that heat. And as I mentioned before, if this is done for a long period of time, it will lead to necrosis or cell death in that epidermis, and that's what we call frostbite. I also will, as I mentioned, cause the erector pili muscles to actually contract so that I can raise the hair follicles and have a stagnant layer of air next to my skin. I will have sensory functions of my skin. I have different types of receptors. I have mechanoreceptors. There are two types, there are actually more, but there are two main types that will detect pressure and vibration. There's a frequency difference between these, but not important for our purposes. And what happens is that when I press down on a portion of that skin, that pressure will cause a physical deformation of ion channels. That allows the ion channels to open, an electrical signal is therefore formed, and that's what I actually am sensing. I do have receptors for temperature and also for pain. These are generally unmyelinated nerve cells that influence the rate of discharge of those nerve cells depending upon temperature or pain. In general, I will detect changes in not absolute amounts of temperature. So for example, if I change the temperature of my index finger from ambient temperature, let's say it's 80 degrees Fahrenheit to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, going down 60 degrees, that would be a change of 60 degrees, but if I went from 80 degrees to 140 degrees, it's still that same signal, that same change in terms of this. I do have some chemoreceptors that respond directly to certain types of chemicals. For example, substance P is a substance that will respond directly. So if I have capsaicin, which is what is used in pepper spray, that substance will be viewed as noxious. It will create a stimulus that will be noxious to the receptors, the chemoreceptors on my skin. Also serotonin, acids, and histamine are in this. So I hope that I've given you an overview of your skin, which occupies pretty much a large portion of your body. And we'll talk more about some of the other systems as we go through this medical physiology portion. So stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe if you have not so that you learn about things as they come online. And I will see you in the next section.